The reading is from John chapter 1, verse 14 through 18. It's found on page 860 in the small print Bible and on page 1509 in the large print Bible, if you want to find that. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. John testified concerning him. He cried out, saying, "This is the one I spoke about when I said, 'He who comes after me has surpassed me, because he was before me.' Out of his fullness, we have all received grace in place of grace already given. For the law was given through Moses. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God but the one and only Son, who is himself God and is in closest relationship with the Father, has made him known." This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks, Melissa, for reading that for us. Let me add my welcome to Marla. It's great to see you here. Particularly if I haven't met you before, I'm Pete Nicholas. I'm the senior pastor here. And we're thinking this evening about what it means when we think about God becoming a person, God becoming human. Now, the playwright and thinker and writer Dorothy Sayers once said this about the Incarnation. She said, "The Incarnation is the most dramatic thing about Christianity, and indeed the most dramatic thing that ever entered into the mind of man. But if you tell people so, they stare at you in bewilderment." What she's saying is that, I don't wonder if you've had a bit of this. We get so familiar with the kind of Advent season, Christmas, and all the Christmas lights and decorations. We can get caught up with the different things we've got to do, buying last-minute presents, getting ready for travel plans, etc. And so, to some extent, we can be so familiar with what it is that we're celebrating that we no longer think of it as stunning and as life-changing as it really should be. But when we actually pause to think about it, the implications, she's saying, of the idea that and the reality that God became a person are so utterly astonishing that you should never be the same again. And yet we struggle to grasp the enormity of it. And indeed, that's very much what John is writing about in those few verses that we had read for us. He's writing about some of the implications of what it means that God became a man. So we're going to try to unpack at least some of those implications tonight. We're going to think about three things that John highlights for us and the applications of those three things. First of all, we're going to look at we have seen God. Secondly, we are going to look at his glory, the glory of God being revealed in the Incarnation. And thirdly, we're going to think about him dwelling among us. So we have seen his glory, he dwelt among us. Three phrases John uses, but each which we unpack and have enormous implications for us. Let's think first of all about that first one. We have seen. Now, here's the question. How can you know what God is like? It's one of the great questions we face. Many of us today would like to describe ourselves as those who are spiritual in a general sense, but we're not so sure what God is like. And so we might say we're spiritual, but we wouldn't want to affiliate with any particular religion. How can we possibly know after all? And there's a humility there, rightly, to say that, God is going to be beyond my full understanding, so I can't necessarily know what he's like. But John writes with great degree of certainty. He says this, verse 14, "The Word," that is logos in the original Greek, it's a phrase or a word that he was using for God, "the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth." We have seen. John picks up on this theme in his first letter. In 1 John chapter 1, he writes this, "That which was from the beginning," that's God, "that which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked at and our hands have touched, this we proclaim concerning the word of life." Again, notice the language, the kind of witness language he uses. We have seen, we have heard, we have touched. We have engaged, we have been engaged by this God because God has become flesh, and therefore we've seen. Now, it's difficult to underestimate the enormous implications of this. Let me try to give you an illustration to unpack it. Imagine that you and I and a bunch of other people wake up in a room, And as we wake up in the room, we can't remember anything that's happened to us beforehand. All we can ever remember is this room. And the room in this illustration represents space and time. And you and I, we represent humanity. And there are different people in the room as we wake up. And here we are in the room. We're trying to figure out why the room is here, where the room came from, how we should act in the room, whether there might be something beyond the room, all of those big questions of life. But all we've ever known is the room. And so we get thinking, we get talking. And one person, let's call them the scientific materialist, starts measuring things out in the room and starts noticing the dimensions of the room and starts noticing that if they drop a ball in the room that it bounces. And so they can tell us certain things about the dimensions of the room, some of the things about the way the room functions, but they can't tell us anything about why the room is there, how we should live in the room, what happened before the room, whether there's any kind of being outside the room. Nothing inside the room can tell you about things outside the room. That's the scientific materialist dilemma. And so that person might say something which sounds vaguely plausible, like, well, I think there was a big bang and the room came about, and I don't think the room's going to be here forever, but they don't really know. They can only tell you what's in the room. They can't tell you about what's outside the room. There's another person, let's call them the spiritual religious person, and they say that as they've been praying, they have some kind of connection to a being who's outside of the room. And that being has revealed to them how we are to live in the room, why the room is there, how the room came about, all the rest of it. But again, I mean, they're going on ultimately some kind of connection to outside, and whether it's actually there, but it's kind of an educated spiritual guess. Other people, and this represents a lot of people today, will just say, well, I don't want to believe that the room is all there is, because that sounds a bit cold, a bit too hard-edged. So I'd like to think that there's more than the room, but I don't really know, so I'm just going to try and be a good person in the room and hope that that's enough. That's the spiritual but not religious person. And then as we're all discussing this, and we might even have some debates, and some won't be so well conducted, and others will be better conducted about, well, who's right and who's wrong, suddenly a door opens into the room. And then a person from outside the room walks into the room and says, I made the room. I'm the only one who's ever been outside the room, and I can tell you why you're here, why the room's here, what came before the room, what comes after the room. I can answer all your questions. Now, wouldn't that person settle all the debates? Because every other person who's just going with the opinions of in the room is at best making educated guesses. But when God, or the being from outside the room, walks into the room and says, guessing's over, see me, hear me, know me, touch me, the debate's over. Well, that's the claim of the incarnation. God, the one who is outside of the room, outside of space and time, the one who brought about space and time, stepped into the room and said, no need to guess. I'm revealing to you what I am like. This is the claim of Jesus Christ, that he is the God who made all things. The Word, how did God make things? By his Word. So when John says the Word became flesh, he's saying the divine act of speech, God himself who spoke the world into being, reveals himself in space, time, and history. And so John and the apostles engage with and meet Jesus, and then they write it down for us so that we might know what he's like and we might have a relationship with him. Now, if God has stepped into the room, then it would stand to reason that God can tell us what he's like and he can define what he's like. But here's one of the things, we really struggle with that. And because God is so great and so much higher than us, we struggle to engage with God as he really is. And so well-meaning often, we say things like, well, if there's a God, I would like to think of him as this. Or we often use a virtue of God. We say, well, because God is loving, I'm sure God wouldn't do this. And God would want me to be happy. He wouldn't contradict me in this way. And so we kind of try to take a mixture of, well, God has revealed what he's like, but then when it's awkward and we don't like how he's revealed what he's like, we say, well, God can't be like that because it doesn't fit my idea of God. But that's us trying to bring God down to size. You see, it stands to reason that if there's God, he is so much greater, so much bigger, so much more glorious than we could possibly think, that he's not going to neatly fit into our categories. And so when we engage with God and get to receive what he's like, we have one of two options. We can either try to bring him down to our size, or we can let him raise us up to his greatness. And which do we frequently do as human beings? Well, we find it too uncomfortable, so we try to bring him down to our size. And there we try to diminish him. We say, well, my God wouldn't speak to me like that, or God loves me. He wouldn't contradict my behavior in that way. And we're trying to bring him down. Now, in any other walk of life, we kind of get how that doesn't work. Imagine that you are, I don't know if you're a musician, imagine you're a violinist, and so you come across the great Hilary Hahn, the violinist, and you're a kind of mid-level violinist, and so you get the opportunity to play with her. Do you think that's going to be comfortable? On one level, it would be awesome, right? But it's not going to be comfortable because she's so great at the violin that you, by comparison, are not great. And so you've got two options. You could say, Hilary, could we just play some easier pieces? And that makes you feel comfortable. But then you don't grow, you don't improve. Her greatness does nothing to you because you bring her down to your level. Or you can choose to be humble and say, I need to learn from you. And that's going to be uncomfortable because she's so much greater than you. But it's going to enable you to grow. So it is with God, and how much more. Every time we come into contact with God and we read about him, we can say, well, I'm not quite sure I like that. It's too uncomfortable. We can try and bring him down to our level, or we can let him raise us up. And the question really is whether we want to grow or not. If we want to grow, we have to admit that God is so much greater than us, so much bigger than us. We have to let God be God. And that's never been comfortable for human beings. As Marla so helpfully said, it wasn't comfortable for Mary. But she was a great model of humility. She said, let it be according to your word. In other words, let you define the terms, because you're God. God has walked into the room. John says, we have seen him. The question for all of us is, will we let God be God? Secondly then, we have seen, and secondly, his glory. John goes on, we have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. Now, the word glory means a value or significance or dignity. And one of our great questions for us as human beings is to try to work out, are we valuable? And the way that we normally try to work out whether we're valuable or not, at least in the West currently, is by what we achieve. We think if we achieve enough, then we will know that we're valuable. And we've been doing this since we were little children, right? Because we learned pretty early on as little children that when we do certain things, when we do well at school or in sports or in music or whatever it is, when we're charming or witty, then people seem to value us more. And so we receive from the world that we are valuable based on what we achieve. And so we get pretty good at this. And we've all got, the strong suit, as it were. When you're playing cards and you have the trump card or the suit that's going to win the hand. And so we get good at playing our strong suits to show everyone that we're valuable. And so we play that bit of wit and charm, or we leverage gently our resume, or we show people what we can do for them. And then we feel a sense of value and dignity and glory. But if God has walked into the room and we have seen his glory, there's a different way, a better way to know you're valuable. And it's not to achieve your glory, rather it's to receive your glory from him. That is to know you're valuable because he has shown you how valuable you are. Do this thought experiment with me. I wonder if I was to say to you that I had a pair of 2003 Nike sneakers. I wonder, they're obviously vintage Nike sneakers, how much you think they would be worth. So I looked it up on eBay as I was preparing for this, and $20 to $30, that's how much they're worth. But then, imagine if I told you that those Nike sneakers from 2003 were actually the very same Nike sneakers that were worn by LeBron James in his debut rookie season. Do you know how much they're worth? $222,000. What's the difference? The same pair of shoes. The difference is who's worn them. LeBron James wore them, right? And because his glory, the glory of, one of, in the debate, you can talk to me afterwards about, the greatest basketball players ever. Let's put him at least in the top 5, shall we? That he's worn the shoes and his glory is rubbed off on those shoes, as it were. And so they are now not $20 to $30. They are 100,000 times that amount, right? That's how it works. Well, in a similar way, to say that God has become a man is to say, metaphorically, that he's walked in our shoes. And therefore, it's to say that God does not think that humanity is beneath him. Far from it. One of the great questions we have in the West is, are we valuable? We ask it on a big level, but many of you are asking it on a day-to-day level. In fact, lots of people come to New York trying to figure out how valuable they are. If I can make it here, I can make it anywhere, as the song goes. And so we try to determine our value. But you cannot fruitfully determine your value by what you achieve. You can only determine your value by receiving it from God. the God who has taken on human flesh, who has walked in our shoes, and who says, this is how valuable you are. You are so valuable that God does not think it beneath him to become a person. And therefore, every person made in the image of God, and with God inhabiting human flesh and then redeeming human flesh, is of inestimable value. You are wonderfully valuable. And receive that. You know, the scripture talks about our attempts to determine our value by what we achieve with a particular phrase. In the Greek, it literally means empty glory, sometimes translated vain glory. In other words, all of our attempts to achieve value ultimately lead to emptiness. And throughout history, we've been telling each other stories to try to help us realize this and wake up to this. The Greeks told the story, of course, of Sisyphus. And you know Sisyphus, he pushed a big boulder up a hill, and when it got to the top of the hill, what happened to the boulder? It rolled all the way back down, and he was destined to do that for eternity. And it was a story told of humanity's search for value in this life. Nothing's valuable enough. Vanity, vanity, the writer of Ecclesiastes says. All is vanity. Vain glory if you try to pursue value in what you achieve. Or take a more modern story. I wonder if you've read Andre Agassi's autobiography, Open. It's a brilliant, brilliant book. Ghost written by a Pulitzer Prize winner with a fascinating story of Andre Agassi. And in it, he reflects when he won his first Grand Slam in 1992. And this is what he writes. He writes, I'm supposed to be a different person now that I've won a slam. Everyone says so. But I don't feel Wimbledon has changed me at all. In fact, I feel as I've been let in on a dirty little secret. Winning changes nothing. Now that I've won a slam, I know something that very few people on earth are permitted to know. A win doesn't feel as good as a loss feels bad, and the good feeling doesn't last as long as the bad. Not even close. Empty glory. And you can think, oh, maybe he's doing something wrong. Maybe you're going to discover some secret that the ancients haven't discovered. There is no way of determining your value by what you achieve. It's never enough. You never feel like you've done enough or you are enough. The only way to know how valuable you are is to look at Jesus Christ, God become a person, walking in your shoes and saying, have my glory, receive my glory. You are of infinite worth. I love you. I made you. I took on your flesh because you're not beneath me. And now know your value. And when you get that, then suddenly you can go out into the world and you can say, I can achieve things, I can do things, and I can take them as they are, just things that I do. They don't define me. They can still be good things, but they're not ultimate things. We have seen, and then secondly, his glory. Will his glory be your value? And lastly and thirdly, he dwelt among us. I wonder who here likes going camping. I have to say, in the Nicholas household, we're a little bit divided on the whole idea of camping. So when we got married, my wife and I had this discussion about whether we were going to go camping or not. And Rebecca insisted that we were going to go camping, and I insisted that, for me, camping is either one of two things. Either you don't do it at all and just go to a hotel and have a normal bed that's actually comfortable and have a toilet that's not a hole in the ground and, have a shower and don't smell bad for 7 days. Or you kind of go boy's own Survivor, Bear Grylls, kill your own food, eat your own food, that type of way. But there shouldn't be anything in between. Glamour camping, glamping is just an oxymoron. There's nothing glamorous about camping. If you want the glamorous experience, go to a hotel. Much more glamorous there, right? But so Rebecca said, no, I think you're being too black and white, which I'm prone to. And so she said, we're going to get a tent on our wedding list. And I said, okay, I don't think we're going to use the tent. And at our 10-year anniversary, we sold the tent as new. Never used. Never used. The only argument I've ever won in our whole marriage. Because here's the point. When you go camping, the whole point about camping is it's not particularly comfortable, right? It's not a comfortable bed. It's not a comfortable bathroom experience. You get wet in the middle of the night because the outside lining touched on the inside lining and suddenly it starts coming through. And, you don't get that. The whole thing about camping is it's temporary. It's not comfortable. The word used for he made his dwelling among us is often pointed out by the commentators. It means he tabernacled or he camped among us. There was a festival that the Jews did called the Feast of Booths, and they would camp out in Jerusalem under canvas to remind themselves of the way they left Egypt. And it wasn't comfortable. And so it says here that when Jesus became a person, when the Son of God became a person in Jesus, he camped among us. That is, it wasn't comfortable. It wasn't easy for him. G.K. Chesterton wrote this in his poem, The House of Christmas. A child in a foul stable where the beasts feed and foam, only where he was homeless are you and I at home. Jesus stepped down from all the glory of heaven. He gave it all up, all the splendor and glory of heaven, which would make even the finest splendor and glory of the finest residences here look like, well, the worst possible shanty. He gave it all up, became a human being. Why did he do all that? Not just did he give it up to become a human being, but he lived in poverty. He lived with great humility. He was a man acquainted with sorrows. He suffered. And then he even suffered to death, and then the worst possible death, even death on a cross. Here's how Paul, writing in Philippians chapter 2, puts it. Who, being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing, taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. You know what this is saying? He's saying that Jesus gave up his home. Why? Because it was in him giving up his home that he's able to welcome you and I home. That's ultimately what the incarnation is about. So we can see God and know what he's like, so we can know that we're valuable, and so finally, at the end of all things, God can call us back to himself and call us home. You know, one of the great searches in life is to find home. In some sense, we're all searching for home. It's been said that everywhere else tells you to fit in, but home is the place that fits you, that suits you. And when you find that place, then you know you're really home. Home is the voice that calls you in out of the cold. That's been doing it for years since you were a little child. Tells you that it's time for your dinner. Come in, you're home. Home is that familiar seat and that familiar place. And you look around and everything's just in the right place. Home is your bedroom. You go there and you're an adult and you're grown up, and yet you still smile as you see that photo or that little medal or that book and you remember that memory. Then you know you're home. When the world is against you and it feels like a storm is raging and you find shelter, then you're home. When people feel like they're against you, but you're with that group of people, or maybe just that one person who's always got your back, who's always got your corner, who actually loves you and cares about you enough to call you out even when you've got it wrong, then you know you're home. Home is rest for the weary. Home is healing for the brokenhearted. Home is hope in the face of injustice and darkness. When you put all that together, this world made new, the Bible calls it home. And Jesus' great work is to come and give up his home. Why? Because, my friend, he wants to take you home. He wants to bring you home. Only where he was homeless are you and I at home. Why did he go from heaven to earth? Why did he go from earth to obscurity, to humility, to suffering, to death on a cross? Why? He did it all for you, for me, so that you and I might come home. He gave up his glory so that we might be filled with his glory for all of the ways that we strive to realize our value outside of him, though we were never meant to. So that you and I might look at him giving up his home and say, that's how valuable I am. That the one who is glory infinite and eternal has become nothing for me, that I might come to him. I'm home. And really growing in the Christian life, whether it's the first step on your journey or whether it's the 1,000th step of a long, long journey, growing in the Christian life is to realize more and more that in Jesus Christ you have the one who's come to you and says, I'm preparing a home, a place for you. My friend, come home. Of course, the problem is that this world never really feels like home to us, and so we try to get too comfortable here. But part of the discomfort is actually God's intention to keep pointing us to this world made new. And when we get there finally, then we'll look around and we'll look at each other in the eye and we'll say, my friend, I can't believe it. I'm home. I'm home. That's what Christmas is about. We have seen his glory. He has dwelt among us to bring us home. Let me pray. Heavenly Father, thank you so much for this message. We started with those words of Dorothy Sayers that the incarnation is so dramatic, but we don't really grasp the enormity of it. Lord, forgive us for that. Help us to get a little bit more this Advent season of the enormity of the incarnation, that we might know what you're like, that we might receive our value and worth from you, and that we might hear your call beckoning us home. We ask all this for Jesus' sake. Amen.